G'day groovers, rockers and in between. This is Vinyl Vibes. I'm your host, Jack Hodgins. Today we are talking with former saxophonist of Dexys Midnight Runners, Paul Speare. Paul started playing music at the age of 15 and never stopped. While working as a music teacher in Birmingham, Paul frequently did session work at a local recording studio called Outlaw Studios. Dexys Midnight Runners also frequented the studio, and at one point they were looking for a saxophonist. Paul was put in contact with Dexys by the owner of Outlaw Studios and soon joined the band on a temporary basis. After doing his first work for the band, playing the group's hit, Geno, on the 1980 Top of the Pops Christmas special, Paul decided to join as a full-time member. Paul would go on to play on Dexys' legendary album, Too-Rye-Ay, and the worldwide hit, On Eileen. However, before the album or the On Eileen single were hits, Paul left Dexys Midnight Runners due to financial struggles. After leaving Dexys Midnight Runners, Paul's remained in music, working with the likes of Elvis Costello and more recently releasing his 2023 EP, In Search of Abbott. G'day Paul and welcome to Vinyl Vibes.
Hi Jack, thanks for inviting me on.
And thanks for getting back to me and coming on. I wanted to start off right at the beginning. I've read you were born in 1955 in Essex. What can you tell me about your childhood?
Oh well, I was brought up on an estate in Dagenham called the Becontree Estate, which in its day was the largest in the world of its type, or largest in Europe anyway. It was a large local authority estate, so very working class. The main employer in the area was Ford's, the car maker. My dad was one of the rare people who didn't work at Ford's, but he worked at a little truck company in East London. But it's very near East London, so I consider myself partly an East Londoner.
Do you remember your first musical memory? Like, does that stay with you?
Oh, yeah, very well. I mean, I have memories that go back to when I was very, very young indeed. And my parents or my mum used to sit me on a chair next to my brother's radiogram and play records, because I suppose it kept me quiet and occupied when I was very small. And so I got to learn all the titles of the records by their label, what the label looked like. So I think some of the first words I ever spoke were probably the titles of my brother's rock and roll records, actually. One in particular that I still have the record now is called Hoots Mon, a really brash rock and roll version of a sort of Scottish Highland type thing, really. With a raucous tenor sax and really loud drums. And it's a great tune, actually. And it's got a chorus in it that goes, Hoots Mom, there's a moose hoose about this hoose, which you may not understand, but there's a moose loose about the house is what it means. But yeah, it's pretty crazy stuff. There was a lot of rock and roll stuff by Little Richard, Buddy Holly, things like that. It was all my brother's records because he was 15 years older than I was.
Because I know that you play a lot of jazz stuff. I mean, did jazz enter your musical influences at all?
Not till much later on in life. Probably in my teenage years, really, I first became aware of jazz. I'm not sure quite when it first happened. I remember a TV programme when I was about 14 and there was a big band on and it was quite modern stuff actually on the TV. You wouldn't probably find that sort of music on the telly now, you know. But in the sort of early 70s and that, there was a lot more variety of music around in the media, I think, on the TV especially. And I remember that sticking in my head, that swing beat, you know, and the saxes and the brass. And it was really quite exciting. I think from there, I started discovering bands like Soft Machine, who had jazzy influences. Also then the Mahavishnu Orchestra, I don't know if you remember them, John McLaughlin, big fusion sort of sound. And that was very jazz influenced. And then a bit later on, I got more into what you might call purer jazz. But that was my way in, really, through bands like Mahavishnu and Soft Machine.
Your music teacher, I think her name was Dorothy. I've read somewhere, Dorothy, your music teacher, had a massive influence on you, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, really... I have to put everything I've done in music, I have to give her the credit for it, really, because she got me interested enough in music lessons to want to pursue it. You know, I had no background in music in my family at all, or the arts. They were a very working class family and they had no experience of these things, really. So it was Dorothy that opened the door for me to get really interested in music. obviously the breakthrough for me was starting to learn the flute. And then that sort of led on to the saxophone. So Dorothy got me interested enough to want to do that. It was almost a process of elimination, really, because I had to learn an instrument and get a grade 6 exam to be able to do the A level in music, which was the final exam at school, you know. So it was like, well, what instruments do we have in the cupboard at school? And what do we have teachers for? So it was either going to be a brass instrument, which I didn't really fancy, or it was going to be woodwind, which was frank, and I could have done flute or clarinet because they had those in the cupboard, you know. So I started, I thought, well, I quite like the flute, really. So I started learning on a school instrument, which was really tatty. I mean, there were two in the cupboard. One was more tatty than the other, so I just used the least tatty one. A bit later on, when things were getting a little more serious, my parents, you know, got some money together and bought me a student flute, which was much better than the old school one.
Yeah, I mean, because I mean, after that too, I mean, you kept going. I mean, you went to the London College of Music. I mean, take me through that part in your life. Yeah.
Yeah, well, once I took up the flute, I couldn't put the thing down. I mean, it was just like, you know, I just found my vocation completely. And before that, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. Or as a job. But as soon as I took up the flute, and Frank, my teacher, was a sort of mentor, really, not just for playing the flute, but also for how you could make a living out of music, you know. And so, yeah, I got myself into the London College of Music, which, of course, was a very straight classical environment. And my background was, as you've heard, you know, listening to more pop and rock and jazz type material. But you couldn't do any of that at music college. There were no teachers teaching jazz techniques, or you couldn't even play the saxophone at college, or you couldn't have lessons in it anyway. And so I just pursued the classical flute direction, really. I had a very, very good teacher called Adrian Brett, who was quite well known. So, yeah, I sort of went along that route. But alongside that, I'd already taken up the saxophone. And although it sat in the cupboard for a year, my first year of college, that started coming back out. And then my flatmates and we started a band up, and we used to have people round the flat jamming. And it was almost like our flat was an annex of the music college, really. But this is where you did all the jazz and funk, you know. So, yeah, you know, it wouldn't go away, the popular side of music, the commercial side, if you like. And so I was doing the two things alongside each other. But of course, another thing that happened was like right early on in the first year of London College. I mean, I was playing in Bach orchestras and, you know, things like that. But somebody came up to me and said, oh, I've got a card here of a singer that wants a flute player, and I'm not going to be able to do it. Do you want to do it? So I rang up this singer, and his name was Steve Constantine. He was a Greek pop singer. I started playing in his band, and then he made a single, which he was getting produced himself. It was quite a big thing to do in those days. I mean, we talked about 1975. And that was the first time I went into a professional recording studio. You know, I found immediately I really liked that environment. And then they started calling me back to do other session work for people. And that's how I first got involved in doing session work on the flute and the sax. It all happened quite quickly, and there was a lot going on at once, if you know what I mean, when I got to music college.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, I think it was Outlaw Studios you're doing the sessions in?
Ah, well, that was later on. That was in Birmingham. Because I'd done effectively a degree in music, I only had to do 1 year to train as a teacher afterwards. And for some strange reason, I chose Birmingham Polytechnic. Well, I'd never even been to Birmingham. So I ended up there and got a job there teaching the flute after that. I wanted to get in a funk band. I'd seen a friend of mine in London, and lo and behold, an advert went in the Birmingham Evening Mail shortly after that, and it said, funk band wants tenor sax, must be into funk. I always remember that. I rung them up. They were doing a demo at Outlaw Studios, and that's where the connection with Dexys began, because there weren't many studios around in those days, not in Birmingham especially. So Outlaw was a really cool, laid-back place. And so we went in there, and then I joined another band and they went in there. And then I joined another band and they went in there. And of course, I got to know Phil Savage, the engineer, quite well. And one day he rang me up. I mean, I had a teaching job for 2 years by this time, teaching the flute in schools. And he rang me up, Phil, and he said, "Oh, I've had a contact from Dexys Midnight Runners, who do their demos at this studio, and they're looking for a tenor sax player." And I thought, oh, well, there's no way I'll ever do that. I'm all right with my little job and my flat. And but then, of course, I went to meet Kevin and in a cafe in Birmingham, the Apollonia. And the next thing I knew, I was in Dexys Midnight Runners and I'd left my teaching job.
Because I've read when you had to audition for the band, and it was a bit of a interesting audition. It was a bit, I think you describe it, I've read this somewhere, it was a total cultural shock for you. Like, take me through that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you've got to remember that I was always listening by this time to jazz-influenced music, jazz funk in particular. The bands that I'd played in thus far in Birmingham were all jazz funk bands. So to suddenly find myself in this very cold, semi-derelict rehearsal room with, we used to call it the fridge, and of course it was winter when I joined as well, so it was bloody freezing, in there. It was almost a semi-derelict warehouse. Yeah, suddenly I was playing all this sort of, I mean, Kevin would not like me calling this, but pop music, And it seemed quite simple, really, compared to what I was used to playing. And so it was a bit of a culture shock. And also the people were as well, different, that were in the band to what I was accustomed to. I'd been playing in bands with like sort of pretty cool jazz funk musicians, with that sort of attitude. And then suddenly I was in this quite weird atmosphere, actually, with Kevin Rowland and some of the other guys in the band who I think what it was, we were all very cautious when we were working with Kevin, especially early on, because he'd replaced most of the lineup, you see. Most of us were new to the band as well. That's the other thing. And so Kevin's a bit difficult to read at times, and there would be long silences at the end of running through something where he would be thinking about it. And then he'd go to someone, "What do you think about that?" And they'd go, "Well, I thought it was good." And then he would say, "Well, it was good, but not great." That was one of his favourite phrases. So it was an odd environment to find myself in. And also suddenly I was on 60 quid a week, which was a bit of a pay reduction in pay from what I was used to in teaching. I was out in the world without any sort of safety net, really, suddenly. And that became more of an acute problem as time went on, because money became more and more scarce. Because that year was quite a fallow year for the band. They'd had success with the first album, Searching for the Young Soul Rebels. But now this was a new lineup. The record company, EMI, weren't too confident about its prospects. And so there wasn't a lot of support there. So we were working pretty much unaided for a while, by a real record company support. And it did feel like we were out on a limb. But then Phonogram picked us up a bit later that year, and they put us another single out, because the first one we did with EMI, Plan B, that flopped, really. It was a great record, but it sort of flopped, mainly because I think they hadn't pressed enough copies to promote it properly. Phonogram picked us up, and we had a minor hit then with a song called Show Me, and we actually got then on Top of the Pops, and so that gave us a little bit of a springboard.
Yeah, well, I mean, am I right in suggesting that one of the first things you did with Dexys was Geno on the Christmas 1980 Top of the Pop special? Did you perform on that one? Yeah.
I did. You've done your research, haven't you? Yeah, because that's a sort of an interesting one. That I hadn't even joined the band at that time. I was thinking about it. They said to me, "In the meantime, can you come in and record Geno with us and do Top of the Pops, Christmas Top of the Pops?" Because it had been #1 that year, so they wanted to put it on the Christmas show. So I went along to Air Studios, and they hadn't got an alto sax player by then to replace the previous guy. So I had to play the tenor and the alto on that backing track. Because they used backing tracks on top of the pops. And then we went in and did the show. So suddenly I was on the TV and I hadn't even really joined the band. And I went home for Christmas to see my mum and dad. And I didn't tell them about this. And so it came on in the afternoon, 3 o'clock, Top of the Pops on Christmas Day. And we're sitting around and I said, oh, by the way, I'm going to be on this. And they were a bit like bemused and said, oh, what's that about? And then my mum said afterwards, oh, well, that was a nice experience, wasn't it, for you? And I said, yeah, well, I'm going to be joining the band, so I'm going to be doing it all the time, mum. And of course, she was really worried and shocked because she liked me having a secure job and all that sort of thing. But yeah, it was a bit of a risk, really. I think I basically got to a point where I thought, if I don't take this opportunity, it might never come again, you know. And really my intention when I was younger was always to be a professional musician, to be out there actually playing, all right, possibly doing some teaching on the side. My aim was never to be a teacher as a career. I had to think about that seriously and think, well, hang on, this might seem risky, but this might be your opportunity. And of course, it turned out that it was, because it was a way in to lots of other professional work that I did later on and still do to this day. But it was quite ironic because I had friends that were in Birmingham doing the same course as me for a year, and they said, oh, after this I'm going to London to get professional work. And I didn't do that. I stayed in Birmingham, and this opportunity came up and I took it, and that led to everything I've ever done since, really.
So you've joined the group January 1981. Around that time, early 1981, Dexys records Plan B, the Plan B single, as you were talking about. As that being the first recording session with the band, I mean, what was that like? That experience recording with Dexys Midnight Runners for the first time? Yeah,
it was a baptism of fire in a way, because although I'd been used to working in studios to some extent before, it was the first time I think that I realised how rigorous the procedure can be. We had for Plan B, we had a producer called Alan Shacklock. Now, he was the guitarist and founder member of a band in the 70s called Babe Ruth. They were a sort of a rock fusion band, really. And I had their first album. And I didn't realise that this guy was the same guy, that was on this album that I really enjoyed at the time. But he was a real perfectionist. So what I do remember with recording the brass section on Plan B, it's got a couple of tricky bits in it for the brass. There's that bit that goes, that's quite difficult to get tight, and because it's very quick. Although Jim and Brian and I were all of us pretty good players, when you get in a studio, little, details like that can sort of stand out. And so Alan Shacklock was making us do certain phrases over and over again. And we were thinking, oh, that must be it now. We've got it there. Because, you can feel when something is right. And he would say, no, we need to go again. Still needs to be tighter. And I do remember that. We were in there quite a while getting those horn parts really tightened up.
Because I've read too that with the Plan B single, that because there's a different version on the Too-Rye-Ay album of Plan B, and I've read that you prefer the single version. I mean, what was it about the single version of Plan B that like resonates with you more than the album version? Yeah.
How do I describe that? Yeah, I definitely prefer the original single. I think it sounds a bit more. It sounds deeper and grungier to me, more powerful. I don't know whether it's the playing. It's certainly something to do with the production. Also, in particular, I prefer the trombone solo on the original single to the mouth organ solo on the album version. I've never liked that mouth organ solo. But the story behind that mouth organ, I think, is that basically Jim by then had left the band and he came back to do the album, and Brian as well. They both left, but I'd stayed for the time being. But I think the reason Jim wasn't playing a solo on the album version of Plan B was because Kevin felt perhaps he wasn't a member of the band anymore.
Mhm.
And so he'd have something else, perhaps more folky or Celtic, because he was going for that sound. And so the producers got in a session player. I don't know who it was. I never met the player on it. I wasn't there when it was done. But when I heard it, I thought, oh gosh, just give me back the trombone solo on this. It was much better.
April 1981, the projected Passion Review tour, that's when that begins. But of course, there was rehearsals leading up to that tour. I mean, do you remember much about the rehearsals?
Oh, yeah. We went up to Newcastle upon Tyne. That was because Paul Burton, the manager, Basher Burton, as we used to call him, he was a Geordie. He was from Newcastle on Tyne, and he owned or had an interest in, anyway, an old cinema called the Royalty Cinema. And it was a proper old Edwardian picture house. It was really charming and a bit dilapidated. But the point was it had quite a large stage in front of the screen. And I don't know what the reasons were for sending us up there, but basically we could use this cinema during the day, I presume free of charge, to rehearse. And so we went up there, stayed in bed and breakfast places for quite a number of weeks, and we really honed the new set. And we had a great time up there as well, actually. I mean, it could be quite tense in the rehearsals. There were definitely tensions already showing in the band then. Socially, it was great. I mean, I'd never been to Newcastle on Tyne. It's a long way up north for anyone listening to this who doesn't know the geography. It's about 300 miles north of London, 200 north of Birmingham. It's a real party town, actually. It's fantastic. And it's so great. I mean, I've been back there many times since, just for, weekends with the wife and things like that, because we just love the city. Yeah, we were up at this theatre, well, this cinema, rehearsing for weeks on end for the tour. But then when the tour came to begin, the van arrived and we were going to load all the gear into it from the cinema. And Basher, the manager, came downstairs from a phone call and he said, oh, well, I've got some news. It's not very good that most of the tour has been cancelled. And I can't remember what the exact reasons were. I think it was lack of support from the record company, possibly again. We were still with EMI then. Perhaps tickets not selling well enough. There were all sorts of different versions of why it was cancelled. But they'd retained 3 of the dates. And Chelmsford in Essex, the Dominion Theatre in London, which was like the headline one, and one other, I can't remember that was now. So we ended up, after all those weeks of really dedicated rehearsal, only doing 3 dates. And then we went off and did some festivals in Europe after that. So the rehearsal didn't go to waste, but we didn't get the British tour that we were expecting. It only really all came to fruition when Too-Rye-Ay came out, and obviously Come On Eileen being on that, by which time I'd actually left.
In saying that too, because I mean, I think it's December 1981 when the Too-Rye-Ay album, as you were mentioning there, I think that started to be recorded at Genetic Studios. I mean, to my understanding, you did actually play on the album. You just left before it all kind of became a hit. Am I right on that?
Yeah, the album was recorded at Genetic Studios. That was brand new, that studio at the time. The producers were Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley. Did a great job. I mean, wow, what they transformed those songs into, I think, was amazing, actually. Despite the mouth organ on Plan B, I know Kevin never was really convinced about the production of that album, and to the extent where he did a re-release of it last year, didn't he, where it was remixed to some extent. Regardless, they really took that material and transformed it into what it became, a huge hit album with a massive hit single in Come On Eileen. So it was great working with them because they were so creative, those two. Clive Langer used to come up with some great ideas, like on the hoof, while you're in the middle of doing something. Let's just put another brass section over the top here, and build it up. Put harmony on over there. Let's double that thing on a piano drawing pins in the hammers, so it sounds like, more like a harpsichord, things like that. So it was quite inspiring working with them. But there was a lot of unhappiness arising within the band then, and there was with me. And I was finding that after, it was over a year now, I'd been working in this quite tough environment. It was tough in terms of the workload, but also the lack of money. That had put its own stresses on me. I was getting in arrears with my flat. I couldn't afford to use my car. Things like that for quite a while. Buying food was a bit of an issue as well, actually. So it was difficult. And I think it was all starting to get on top of me, really. When the album was completed, I just decided that that was enough for me. And it was something I just couldn't help, really. I had to get out.
During that album, the Too-Rye-Ay album, of course, On Eileen is recorded. I mean, what did you think of the song at first? Like, did Kevin show you a demo, or was it like, did he play it to you guys before recording it? Like, what did you think of it at first?
Well, Eileen came about from a couple of previous songs that we had been rehearsing. I can't remember what they were. One was called Yes Let's, I think. And it had that same sort of semi-swung beat to it, ba-doom, bap, boom, bap, that sort of feel. Anyway, Eileen came about from at least two other songs that we'd been previously rehearsing. They were sort of like stuck together, really, to create the final version that we all know and love, So, yeah, we were familiar with most of the elements of that song. But then, putting in where it all breaks down and you get the gradual picking up of tempo. Come on, Eileen, da, 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 all that bit in the middle. I'm not sure where that came from, but yeah, it's an unusual song, isn't it, that one? But yeah, the ideas were knocking around before we ever got to record it.
Yeah, I mean, is there any memories that pop up for you on the specific recording of Come On Eileen? Like, is anything that pops up for you there?
Well, the album as a whole was all done the same way, so I can't really pick out Eileen as being anything particularly different, but we did all the backing tracks with the whole band actually playing live in the studio. I mean, in those days, we didn't use click tracks or anything like that. Everything was done totally as we would do it live. So the band was all screened off in different areas of the studio, so you didn't get the brass spilling into the drum mics and things like that. And we all just played everything live with Kevin singing. And then they would keep as much of the rhythm track as possible, the drums definitely, obviously. And they would patch up other bits, bass bits, keyboard bits. And then we would redo the brass and all the vocals. And obviously the violins were with us by then. And they were done, I think, separately. So Eileen was pretty much done in that way.
When it was done and when it was like on the tape and everything, I mean, did you think it had the potential to be a hit? Like, was that at all possible for you? Yeah.
It was such an unusual song. I mean, there's never been another song like it, has there, before or since, really. So I think we all realised there was something unique about it. Whether that would translate into it being a hit record, especially on the scale it was, perhaps didn't occur to us, but it certainly stood out as different. That's all I can really remember thinking about it. I do remember we did a little warm-up gig before the Newcastle Radio 1 live show that we did in the summer of 1982. This was just before Eileen got released and became a huge hit. Jim, Brian and I came back because we'd already left the band by then, but they paid us to come back and do this one gig. It is on the CD, actually, this live show at Newcastle. And when we did it there, it went down an absolute storm and nobody even had heard it before. So, it had an immediate effect on people, as I remember.
The moment where you kind of decided to leave was, I think Kevin was going on to holiday to Spain and he wanted you to book a rehearsal room and or something like that. I read this somewhere. I mean, take me through those moments, yeah.
That was not the actual reason that I left. I mean, the reason I left was bigger than that. It was because I was feeling the stress quite seriously of being in this hothouse environment with very little money. The straw that broke the camel's back, you could say, was I was leaving the studio for the last time after the album was, I think, mixed, actually. I think they'd been mixing it. And Kevin and the manager, Paul Burton, they were about to go on a holiday to Spain for a week or two. I was walking out, and just as I was going out, Kevin said, "Oh, can you arrange the rehearsal room for when we get back?" And this was something also I'd never had to do before. I wasn't in charge of booking rehearsal rooms or anything. I did do a lot of menial work, like particularly transporting the gear around, because I was the only one who had a clean driving license that could hire vans. So I was the dog's body in that respect. I often got the short straw, but and driving people home after rehearsals and all sorts of things like that. But asking me to book the rehearsal room was a new one, and it just seemed so offhand, really. And I was already suffering and thinking I might have to go, and that was the end of it. But I didn't say anything at the time. I just said, "Yeah, okay." Went home, and while Kevin and Basher were away, I made my decision to leave. So I rung Seb, the drummer, who was quite a businesslike fellow. And we got on quite well, Seb and I. I rang him up and I said, "No, I'm not going to be coming back, Seb. I just can't do this anymore."
The record hadn't come out by this point. When it did come out, I mean, Come On Eileen was a massive hit, #1 in quite a lot of countries. What was that like for you, seeing this song that you were a part of, do really well? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't great for me. Obviously a part of me was saying, "Oh dear, what have I done?" But on the other hand, I knew that I couldn't stay with the band any longer. I hadn't walked out in a fit of temper or anything like that. It was a decision I had to think about a lot, and I just realised I couldn't do it anymore. So that was the situation, and I had to live with it. I mean, it was a bit frustrating seeing that they had to recruit a new band of session players to do the gigs. And of course, they apparently were, so I've read since, were all getting paid handsomely. And that was ironic because, those of us that had been there throughout all the tough, difficult times, through thick and thin, we hadn't at that stage earned anything out of it other than a living wage some of the time. And then suddenly all these other people were getting the benefit of it, the work we'd put in. Yeah, there you go. I mean, you make your decision and you have to live with it, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in saying that too, I mean, it's not like you stopped doing music. TKO Horns, I mean, you formed that with Jim Patterson and Brian Maurice. I mean, take me through that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, every cloud has a silver lining, and what happened, because Jim, Brian and I had left and we stuck together in the end, and it paid dividends for us. We got to work with a lot of other very interesting and quite high profile artists after that. We toured America with Elvis Costello. We did some other interesting albums. The first album we did actually was with a guy called John Watts, who used to have a band called Fisher Z, who were quite big in Europe for a while. He wanted us to tour with him as well, but there was going to be quite a gap between the album and any touring. And we were saying, "Well, look, you'll have to put us on a retainer because otherwise we're going to have to get other work, and we can't guarantee them will be available for your tour." It was just purely sort of good sense. We couldn't hang around with no pay waiting for a possible tour some months later. So then the Q-Tips came up. Now, that was a band that Paul Young used to be in before he did his big solo album. So they approached us and said, "Do you want to do a little college tour with us?" And so we did that. That went on for a couple of months around the UK. At some point during that, we were approached by Elvis Costello. And I think that might have been through Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, the producers of Too-Rye-Ay, because they were going to be doing Costello's next album, which was Punch the Clock. So I imagine it was through them that he approached us. And that was the next stage. So we started working with him. We did the Albert Hall with him at Christmas 1982. We did our last gig with him almost exactly a year later in London at Christmas 1983. But in the meantime, we'd toured, much of the Western world and done an album with him. And he was also getting us a lot of other session work as well.
I want to move forward in time a bit here now to your more recent work. I had to listen to your EP, In Search of Avid. Tell me about that project, yeah.
Well, it started with an EP called Time and Place, actually. What happened was I wanted to break away from doing brass section work because I've been working with Paul Weller as well, in a brass section, a different brass section, doing some session work for two of his albums. And I was getting to the point for quite a long time, really, where I was thinking I'd like to do some music of my own where I'm actually playing the lead part much of the time rather than just being in a section. And also to try and exercise my soloing chops a bit, more in a jazz sort of way. So I wrote some music, and what I did initially was I got 4 tunes together, which were all brand new tunes, and I got a lineup together of people that had never worked together before, and most of them had never worked with me before either. And that was very deliberate because I wanted the environment to be a bit sparky, where people weren't quite sure of each other, and I certainly didn't want any cliques in the band. So anyway, I got this group of really great musicians together, took them into a studio near Canterbury, which is where I live. And we did a YouTube video of 4 live performances. And that's still on YouTube. It's Paul Speare music, if anyone wants to look it up. And it worked out so well. It was so great working with these people. I thought, right, what I'd like to do now is something a bit more complex, because I couldn't do anything too complex. We only had a day's rehearsal and then we were doing this live to video. So I didn't want to bombard them with really difficult material. It's not very easy, but it wasn't my most difficult material. So then I thought, right, I'm going to do another batch of material now, which is more difficult, because I like complex music. I find it interesting. I like a lot of rhythmic complexity and things like that. And so I did an EP, which was recorded at various studios, but it was done not live, it was done more in a conventional recording way where you get one person in at a time. So I started off with the material done here as MIDI stuff, and then we replaced the instruments one by one at different studios. A lot of it was done in my studio here. And that was the EP, Time and Place. Now that's on Bandcamp, which is under my name, Paul Speare. That had 4 more tunes on it, new ones. Did a gig at Pizza Express, and first time I'd ever played my own material live like that. I had to make up 2 whole sets for that event, so I had to write some more stuff. That new material then went on to the next EP, which was In Search of Avid.
My favourite track probably off In Search of Avid is Ephemeral. How did that song come to be? Yeah,
I'm really interested that you picked that one out in particular. Okay, how did it? Because it's got strings on it as well, isn't it? I went to London and got a string quartet playing on that one. How did it come to be? Right, I wanted to write a jazz ballad. That's where it started. I wanted female vocals on it. I knew that Hilary, the keyboard player that was doing all my stuff, had a really good jazz voice. She's done quite a lot of singing and playing the piano. She's played at Ronnie Scott's, places like that. So I thought I would try her on it. But the lyrics I wrote the lyrics myself, but they came from talking to a couple of friends once about their experiences. It was a coincidence. They were saying about friends they'd had that they were losing touch with. And I thought that was a really interesting idea for a song. It's about the title Ephemeral is about the friendship that these people said, it seems that it was ephemeral all along.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you for your time today. And I kind of just, before we go, what's next for you? What's any music in the works? What's happening?
What's happening at the moment, Jack, is I'm actually writing a memoir. So that is taking all my time. I don't know whether that will get commercially published. We'll have to see. When I get nearer to finishing it, we'll see what the options are. I'll definitely self-publish it at the very least. And then I do have plans to do some more music after that.
Well, Paul, I want to thank you again just for making the time. I think we've spoken about some great things about your time in music, and yeah, just thanks again.
Well, it's been lovely talking to you, Jack, and thanks for getting in touch.
That was Paul Speare, former saxophonist of Dexys Midnight Runners. To check out Paul's recent EP, In Search of Avid, you can head to his Bandcamp or his website at paulspeare.com. Remember to share this show with other music fans, and if you really like what you heard today, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Vinyl Vibes, and to all you music lovers out there, stay groovy.